Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
A new political climate in America. This week, President Joe Biden takes immediate action on climate change. We speak to former Democratic rival, now supporter, Tom Steyer about the United States' role in the global climate fight. And is the machinery behind America's green push already broken? Bloomberg investigates the fraudulent forests behind the carbon offset market. Plus, the German Greens extend the olive branch to the U.S. as the former Fringe Party builds government-in-waiting credentials. We speak with its chairman. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York. This is Bloomberg Green. The United States has a new president, Joseph R. Biden, who has pledged to put the environment at the center of his agenda.
This is America's day. We will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again. Not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges.
Global warming is happening today.
The Biden administration clearly intends to be even more ambitious and forceful on climate change.
The next 5 years for many of us that look at the climate science is the make or break time.
It's really becoming one of their signature policies.
Addressing some of the social consequences of this crisis.
It's not a planetary illness, it is a people problem. You can address a pandemic. You can address our economy through investments in clean energy.
The third one I'm going to sign, and that's what I'm going to do while you're all here, is the commitment I made that we're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord as of today.
The Paris Agreement is crucial because, the withdrawal was really an attack also on international treaties.
On this climate question, I think the UK and the US can work very closely together.
The answer is not to turn inward, to retreat into competing factions. We can do this.
One man who sees the field of play from both sides is a self-styled activist and billionaire. Tom Steyer ran against Biden for the Democratic nomination, but has put his weight fully behind the president. He believes that Joe Biden's platform, fighting the ills of climate change and systemic racism, are key to America's future as a global leader. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horder sat down with him.
The argument about whether the climate is changing is over. The argument about whether it's changing because of human activity is over. And we're now into a discussion about what to do about it. I think the idea of moving to a clean energy economy is one which everybody accepts. We're in a global competition to solve climate change, that it's a huge business opportunity, and to miss that opportunity will be extremely painful for the working people of those countries that failed to react successfully.
How important do you think the role of young people was in getting Joe Biden elected?
It was absolutely critical, Anne-Marie. One number to show how critical it was. In May of 2020, Joe Biden had a minus 22% approval rating with young voters. In October of 2020, he had a plus 23% approval rating from those same voters. What changed between May and October was a number of things. But the biggest thing that changed was young people learned how committed Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were to climate action, how much they understood what a priority it was. They campaigned on climate, they advertised on climate, they talked about climate in every single presidential and vice presidential debate. And there's no doubt that was an absolutely critical element of getting a record number of young people to turn out and vote, with a huge spread between those voting Democratic and those voting Republican. In the critical swing states, the turnout of young people absolutely made the difference in terms of electing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Where do you see cleaner jobs, greener jobs coming from? Which industries, which sectors?
The Biden-Harris Build Back Better plan, that was a $2 trillion program over 4 years to rebuild the infrastructure of the United States. That will create millions of jobs, mostly unionized, good-paying jobs across the United States. Beyond that, this is going to be a private sector race. There are going to be companies that build the cars of the future. There are going to be companies that come up with the new forms of green manufacturing for the future. And unless we're the people leading the way, unless we do what Americans traditionally have done, which is to innovate, to have entrepreneurship, we're going to suffer. So it's absolutely critical, not just that government set the framework, but that the private sector respond effectively and in a timely fashion to make sure that we're at the front of the line.
What's your message to people who feel left behind and felt like Trump had their back in terms of their jobs, or they worked in fossil fuel companies, whether it's oil, gas, or coal?
Well, I think that Joe Biden ran on the idea of being the president to every American, not just the Americans that voted for him. This is a president who is going to pull people together. People across this country do feel as if the government has let them down. They do feel as if people have forgotten them and don't have their backs. And so I think it's going to be really important that governments succeed and show awareness and caring for those people. And I have every confidence that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris understand that. They get that in their bones. If you listen to Joe Biden anytime, you know that he's somebody who has a very deep awareness of the dignity of working people, of the rights of working people, that he, in fact, really does have their back. That division and anger about how elites have walked away from working class Americans is something that has been so sharp, and that's really caused a huge amount of pain and anger in this country, and we have to overcome that. And there's nothing that will do that except honestly caring and honestly succeeding.
What do you think for him is going to be most attainable, say his first year in office?
We're going to rejoin the international community as we address climate change. The president-elect said on day one he was going to rejoin Paris. There's going to be a very important UN climate conference in November in Glasgow, and I think that the government is going to be working with other governments around the world to address comprehensively how we can respond to this crisis. Biden-Harris climate goals and their climate program that is very broad-based, it's economy-wide, it's administration-wide, and it's going to have a completely new and powerful coalition behind it, because it's addressing not just climate, but also racial and economic justice, job creation, rights of working people to organize and be paid fairly.
Do you have any plans to join the administration in a climate capacity?
I've been working on climate for more than a decade politically. I've been working on environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice for more than a decade politically. I am going to keep working on those things. I can tell you there's some things in the private sector that since the election at the beginning of November, I've had a chance to reconnect with some of my friends in the private sector to see what's going on. And ultimately, the success of the United States in participating in solving the climate crisis will be driven by the framework the government sets up. But beyond that, it will be driven by the success or failure of private enterprise to lead the world. And there's some things going on that are incredibly exciting, that are transformational, that have to happen if we're going to create those jobs. So I know I'm going to be working on those issues. It's critical that the execution come from the private sector and the entrepreneurs in our country.
Coming up, real forests, fake offsets. We uncovered the flaws in the carbon offset market and take a look at the renewables boom that could be central to America's climate plans in 2021. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and now let's get your green brief. Here's Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know this week. China is welcoming the U.S. back to the Paris Agreement and promising to do more to tackle climate change. The two countries are the world's biggest polluters and were instrumental in reaching the landmark deal back in 2015. More than 170 countries have now signed on. The pandemic may be taking all the headlines, but the World Economic Forum thinks extreme weather and a failure to act on climate change will be the biggest risks of the next decade. It says the pandemic has highlighted the catastrophic effects of ignoring long-term dangers. Total is quitting a leading oil lobby due to a clash over climate change. It's the first oil major to leave the American Petroleum Institute, increasing pressure on others to follow suit. Total criticized the API for supporting candidates at the last election who backed leaving the Paris deal. And the first electric vehicle battery that can charge in under 5 minutes. Israeli company StoreDot is showcasing an e-scooter with the new lithium-ion technology. It likely won't be available on the mass market for years, but reducing charging times could eventually be a game changer for electric vehicles. And that's your Green in Brief. I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in New York. Back to you.
Renewable energy will be key to unlocking President Biden's ambitious climate goals. From the solar boom to an increased focus on wind power, the United States will have to rely on investment and innovation to reach Biden's target of a carbon-free grid by 2035. We broke down some of the key themes that will shape the sector in the year ahead.
Despite the havoc COVID-19 has wreaked on economies around the world, 2021 could mean surging growth for renewable energy. Here are the biggest recent developments and major forces shaping the global renewables market. Solar power installations in the first 9 months of 2020 reached a record. Based on projections by Wood Mackenzie and the Solar Energy Industries Association, 19 gigawatts of solar power were added by the end of the year. President Xi Jinping announced that China will zero out carbon emissions by 2060. The country's main solar industry groups are predicting a surge in business over the next 5 years. Battery storage in the U.S. more than doubled in the third quarter of 2020 from the second. Projects in California were a key reason for the surge. Spain has the greatest solar potential in Europe. Electricity from solar farms in the country was up over 60% compared to 2019, generating at least 15,000 gigawatt hours of power, according to grid manager Red Electrica. Even though its installed capacity is a third of that of Germany, Spain's sector could grow at double the pace in the next 2 years, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. As overall power demand sank during the pandemic, renewable power's share of the grid surged. According to environmental group Ember, about 40% of electricity in the EU came from renewables in the first half of 2020, compared to 34% from fossil fuels. A 67-day period became Britain's longest stretch without coal since the Industrial Revolution. And as wind power grows, the country could completely phase out coal by 2025. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has also vowed to ban new gas-powered cars by 2030 and spend $1 billion toward carbon capture. Abundant sunshine has spurred a love affair with rooftop solar, with about 29% of households now outfitted with panels. In 3 states, daytime demand for grid electricity fell to record lows in 2020, leaving expensive plants running well below capacity. But despite all the progress, there are also new challenges to meet in 2021. Massive lockdown measures led to a 72% drop in solar installations and the slowest addition of wind power in more than a decade. However, bids to develop new solar projects continue to be made, and once India's debt-burdened utilities get their finances in order, solar could become the cheapest option. Clearer skies from shuttered factories and silent streets also allowed for more energy from the existing panels. Prices rose 75% in 2 months when an explosion and flood shuttered 2 Chinese factories producing polysilicon, a key material in photovoltaic cells. Rising costs haven't affected sales, but could ripple through the supply chain. That's bad news for project developers who bid low prices, assuming equipment costs would continue their historic decline. Electricity shutoffs prompted by wildfire risk piqued interest in many homeowners to install rooftop solar and batteries. Ironically, the blazes in Northern California also blotted out the sun, and rooftop solar withered.
Carbon offsets projects are seen as an important tool for companies to get to net zero. Just as you can tick a box when buying a plane ticket and donate $50 to protect a square of forest to offset the carbon emissions of your flight, companies can do the same on a much bigger scale. But Bloomberg has uncovered some flaws in the system. Let's bring in our reporter Ben Elgin for more. Ben, to start, how are carbon credits supposed to work?
Yeah, so there's thousands of companies around the world that are pledging to do their fair share to lower their emissions. But it's hard work because a lot of companies use natural gas or coal to power their factories or diesel to power their fleets and deliver their goods. So a lot of companies are turning to carbon offsets where they pay a third party to reduce emissions on their behalf. So they might plant trees to soak CO2 out of the atmosphere. They might burn methane from a landfill. And the company paying for that activity, in theory, gets to take credit for that CO2 being reduced.
So in theory, that's how they work, but how are they actually working?
Right. So my colleagues and I looked at this for several months and were examining different carbon offset projects to see, are they having the climate benefit that they claim to have? And what we found in some cases, unfortunately, a lot of carbon offsets, the projects are rewarding behavior that was already occurring anyway for different reasons. So the carbon money wasn't changing behavior, and therefore the carbon money isn't changing the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. For instance, we looked at one tree planting project in the Mississippi Delta that was paying private landowners to put trees up on their lands instead of crops. But we interviewed 17 landowners participating in that project, and all of them told us that they were planting trees already. Some had planted them 5 or 10 years earlier to participate in a government conservation program. They were already getting paid to do this very same thing.
Interesting. So how would you go about fixing that? How can the practice of false credits be stopped?
Yeah, so there's thousands of carbon offset projects. So it's a huge marketplace, and it's really hard to regulate. There's a few nonprofits that run, they're called registries, and it's where the carbon offset projects are listed, documents are there about them, companies can look at them and buy them. Unfortunately, as of now, the registries haven't done a good enough job of setting strict enough rules. So you see a fair amount of projects in there that were already happening anyway. And so it's a lot of work, but companies have to go in and kick the tires on these projects, do the research, talk to people like these landowners and figure out, is this real? Are these actual new emission reductions happening, or would we merely be paying for something already happening?
Interesting stuff. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Ben Elgin. Coming up, Germany's Green Party is one of the first to go mainstream in a major economy. We speak to co-chair Annalena Baerbock about working with the new U.S. administration. This is Bloomberg Green. In New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons. This is Bloomberg Green. In the last 5 years, Green parties across the world have started to move from the fringes to the mainstream. But in Europe's largest economy, the Greens are eyeing the very top spot for the first time. Our reporter Aggie Cantrell explains.
There's been a sea change in German politics. After only managing to secure 6th place in the 2017 national elections, the German Green Party has climbed to 2nd in the polls as the country prepares to vote for Merkel's successor this September. Growing concern over climate change and interest in energy transformation, as well as a strong appeal to young voters, has allowed for the once minor party to become a real contender in German politics. The Greens have built up a strong basis of support across the country and now govern in coalitions in 11 of 16 German states. Partially in response to the rise of the Greens, Germany's other main parties have worked to bolster their own environmentalist credentials. Climate policy was a key part of the debate to pick the new leader of Merkel's CDU. They ended up selecting centrist candidate Armin Laschet, who has shown himself willing to work with the Green Party. Meanwhile, the Greens are hoping to set themselves apart from the others with a €500 billion green spending plan that would transition Germany to a carbon-free nation and would be financed through reforming the debt brake as well as taxes on the wealthy and big tech. Now, as Europe's largest economy prepares to go to the polls in September, one of the Green Party leaders could become the kingmaker or indeed the chancellor themselves in the first coalition of a post-Merkel era.
One of those leaders is Annalena Baerbock. Speaking to Bloomberg's Anna Edwards and Matt Miller, the co-chair of the German Green Party said that the U.S. rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement was important in the global effort to fight climate change.
This return to the Paris Agreement is crucial because, the withdrawal was really an attack also on international treaties. So the first and very important step, even though if some people might think this is just pro forma, is very, very important because it strengthened international relationship. But on the other hand, paper doesn't help if we don't reduce CO2 emissions very dramatically. So a big transatlantic agenda on a climate neutral relationship between Europe and the US would be a very, very important signal for the whole world. And this starts, for example, with the question of producing in the future green steel, having electric cars on the road. And I believe that Europe and the new US administration can work very closely together in this field.
How serious is Europe about cutting emissions? How serious is Germany about cutting emissions, especially in the wake of this pandemic that's going to cost the economy so much money? Can Germany continue its commitment or even step up its commitment to stop climate change?
We have to. We definitely have to, because we are all in this crisis together, and it would be dramatically if we slip from one crisis, the COVID crisis, into the climate crisis. So we have to use the buildings which are being now invested into economy to rebuild our economy climate neutral, to build back better, the slogan of the new US administration, but also of the United Nations, has to be also the slogan of the investments in Europe, in Germany. Like every funding we have to give to business has to follow a path for climate neutrality of this sector.
What does that mean for the Green Party? And especially the fact that this seems to be the attitude of many politicians, even center-right parties like the CDU. I mean, do you work with a party like the CDU in order to fight climate change, or do you have to remain radical to keep the ball moving?
We are all in this together, so we have to find solution all together. But unfortunately, not every party, also not in Germany, also not the conservatives you were mentioning, are going the path with the same speed. And we have to be quicker, because global warming is happening today. We had the horrible situations in the US, but all over the world. The year 2020 was a year of fire, so we have to be the firefighters in the front row. So yes, we try to push the conservatives, but also the Social Democrats in Germany to really fulfill the Green Deal, which is the big new project from the European Union with ambitious climate targets. And so far, unfortunately, this big coalition here in Germany has not delivered enough.
That's it for this week, but you can keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green.